Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving straight into the absolute circulatory system of the global energy sector, the oil and gas midstream industry. We're going to unpack exactly how this colossal network operates, and more importantly, how global sustainability standards measure its vital signs.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start by defining the midstream sector, and then we'll track its performance across greenhouse gases, local air quality, ecological impacts, pipeline safety, and finally, competitive behavior. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. Defining the midstream industry.
So what exactly is midstream? Well, under the Sustainable Industry Classification System, or SICS, this sector falls right under the Extractives and Minerals Processing Sector. But get this, it's not about drilling for oil. That's upstream. And it's not about selling gas at the pump. That's downstream. Midstream entities are strictly focused on transporting and storing natural gas, crude oil, and refined petroleum products. They're basically the middlemen, physically moving energy from where it's extracted to where it's actually needed.
Think about the complex journey of a single drop of fuel. First, it's gathered at the wellhead. Then, it goes through some absolutely vital processing and liquefaction. After that, it hits the massive long-haul network. We're talking pipelines, rail cars, and marine tankers. Finally, the energy arrives at huge storage tanks and distribution terminals. Basically, that whole flow, that is the midstream value chain in a nutshell.
Now, to wrap our heads around the sheer scale of all this movement, analysts use a pretty clever equalizer, the metric ton kilometer. Whether a load of fuel is pushed through a giant pipe or hauled across the country on a rail car, this metric normalizes the data. It gives us a true apples-to-apples comparison of these midstream giants.
Okay, so now that we can visualize this massive network of energy superhighways, we've got to ask a pretty critical question. How do accounting standards actually measure the climate footprint of pushing all that energy across the globe?
That brings us to Section 2, Greenhouse Gases and Climate.
When tracking emissions, companies have to look at their gross global Scope 1 emissions, but there's a really vital split here. You've got direct combustion. Think engine exhaust from huge compressor engines and mobile vehicle fleets. But then you have fugitive emissions. These are the sneaky, unintentional, diffuse releases from literally millions of valves and seals. They are tracked relentlessly, mostly because they represent inefficiencies that can actually be found and fixed down to near zero.
And here's a massive point. Within those emissions, entities absolutely must isolate their exact percentage of methane. Methane is an incredibly potent greenhouse gas, you know? Because of that, managing it has become a huge regulatory tripwire, and it's a heavily scrutinized metric for investors for sure.
But let's zoom in a bit. Moving down from global greenhouse gases that affect the climate, we need to transition to localized impacts. What happens to the air quality for communities living right next door to these compressor stations and storage terminals?
Let's dive into Section 3, Managing Local Air Quality. When it comes to local air, the SASB standard definitely does not generalize. It mandates the exact disclosure, in metric tons, of 4 highly specific pollutants: NOx, SOx, VOCs, and PM10. These are the nasty compounds that create local smog and pose real respiratory risks. Actively mitigating these doesn't just protect health, it directly prevents steep regulatory fines and actually improves overall operational efficiency. All right, leaving the air behind, we've got to turn our attention down to the ground. We have to ask, what happens when thousands of miles of pipelines and rail lines cut directly through the earth, especially when they cross protected lands and highly sensitive ecosystems?
Which leads right into Section 4, Ecological Impacts and Spills. Whenever land is disturbed by construction, companies are actually graded on how much of it is successfully restored. And they can't just toss down some grass seed and walk away. The standard demands a genuine process of assisting the recovery of that degraded ecosystem. That's a really high bar set by the Society for Ecological Restoration.
To keep track of ecological accidents, the standard requires reporting the absolute number and the total aggregate volume of hydrocarbon spills that are larger than just a single barrel, which is about 159 liters. Crucially, the accounting specifically flags any spill that happens in highly sensitive regions, like the Arctic or in areas with high biodiversity. So it's not just about transparency in how much was spilled, but exactly where it was spilled. So having explored the ecological footprint and what happens when things go wrong, we really need to know, once the pipes are laid and the trains are running, how does the industry prevent these catastrophic failures in the first place?
Let's look at Section 5, Pipeline Safety and Emergencies.
What exactly constitutes a reportable pipeline incident is strictly defined by some pretty severe metrics. We're talking about things like an unintentional explosion, the release of just 19 liters of a hazardous liquid, a hospitalization, or property damage that exceeds certain defined thresholds. These all trigger mandatory reporting. This kind of zero-tolerance transparency really allows observers to judge an organization's true safety culture.
Now, for the massive rail networks supporting the midstream sector, safety incidents are cleanly divided into two buckets. First, you have accident releases. These are your dramatic, highly visible events like a train derailment or a collision. But then you have non-accident releases, or NARs. These are the unintentional leaks, splashes, or venting from improperly secured valves during completely normal transit. Tracking these NARs is absolutely vital because they point directly to a company's daily operational integrity and procedural compliance.
And finally, Section 6, regulating competitive behavior. Because a lot of midstream pipelines and storage terminals act as natural monopolies, meaning you don't exactly have a competing pipeline right next door, they are heavily regulated. This specific metric tracks any legal monetary losses tied to proceedings involving price gouging, discriminatory service, or unfair access. Basically, it ensures these entities are held accountable and don't abuse their market position at the expense of producers or consumers.
As you've seen throughout this explainer, evaluating this massive, complex industry requires incredibly rigorous metrics. And these exact SASB standards are now integrated globally under the IFRS Foundation. That means they're rapidly becoming the unified global language for investors who are assessing the midstream sector.
I'll leave you with this thought to ponder. As the world closely tracks these vital signs, when every leak, every spill, every emission, and every safety inspection is transparently measured and reported globally, how will that fundamentally shift the future of how we transport the world's energy? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking the big questions.